very much, Jim, and I too acknowledge that we meet on the stolen land of the Gadigal people and pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I also want to thank Jim, because Jim wasn't just my comrade, he was my boss. He hired me. So I feel very honoured to be on the stage with him because, yeah, I'm not a draw card kind of highlight name kind of person, but I'm really grateful to be here and be here with you guys. The other thing I want to say in acknowledging Jim is Facebook does this thing where it reminds you what you posted about on this day previously. And on this day in 2011, I posted about the Barry O'Farrell law changes, and I posted about the complexity of the regulator being your employer. That Barry O'Farrell could not just engage in a contract, but he could also unilaterally break that contract by passing legislation, and there was no recourse. And the thing that he did in that legislation, in addition to the state wages policy and limiting the ability to negotiate above 2.5%, was he also stripped the guts out of the IRC. He said that they could not enforce something that wasn't in line with the policy of the state government. So the state government could essentially change policy at any point, and the IRC had to comply with it, and they couldn't hold anything different, even if there was award terms and conditions. And I want to acknowledge that my first couple of jobs were in Australia working for unions, was working for the railways workers and then working for the firefighters. And state government employees, really high density, majority male, on not terrible conditions, not amazing conditions, but not terrible conditions. And it was a real privilege to have my foundation of unionism in that experience. My last 6 years has been working for United Voice, which is the old miscellaneous workers union. Most people know. United Voice sounds like a Hillsong church or something, but yeah, we're the old missos workers. So we look after low-paid workers, cleaners and childcare workers and home care workers, hospitality workers, and we are and this sounds like a weird thing to talk about, but we're a low-density union. Our density is nowhere near where the railways are or where the firefighters are. In the early childhood educators, we would have about between 9 and 11% nationally, depending on how you cut it. And the reason for that is because the industries that we cover have virtually no job security. So for every 100 people we recruit, and we recruit 125,000 people every 5 years into our union, we lose 106 people. And I got asked by Stuart earlier this evening how we feel as unionists. What's the morale like? And I think you are a terrible unionist unless you're endlessly hopeful, because we lose more than we win, and that's the history of our movement. And I'm proud to be part of a movement that is constantly fighting for the greater good. And part of that is that we win incrementally, and we don't win all the time, but at least we're giving it a bash. But we're in a really scary moment for our organisation. I'm 35 years old. I grew up in New Zealand. Both my parents were unionists. I've worked the majority of my career in the union movement, and it will die in my lifetime unless we turn something around. And that's terrifying, because to me, the union movement is the one handbrake we have on capitalism, right? It is the one thing, it is the that kind of mediates the horrifying impact of the market on individuals and communities. And it is also the most successful social movement we've ever seen in terms of demonstrating the ability to tangibly improve people's lives day to day. And so the idea that I would be witness to the demise of that breaks my heart. So when I think about the morale of the union movement, I think of us as an eminently hopeful group of people, but we're not delusional either. We recognise our challenges, and you know, I finished up on the Friday at the Fireys, where they have 100% density, and I rocked into the Missos on the Monday, and I went and did a action that we did at Westfield Mall, where we wore like cleaning suits and sat in the middle of the food court and then stood up and sung, like did some kind of orchestrated dance, which is horrifying and completely contrary to every like ember of my being. But we have to take action in a way that attempts to engage the public, because we don't have a classic definition of industrial power. The workers that we were supporting on the day that we took that action, their action, the industrial action that they were taking to try and get above minimum wage, was to wear a union t-shirt while they were cleaning instead of wearing their uniform. And they, all of them got sent home for the day and got their entire shift docked for wearing a t-shirt, right? And they were, bar none, international students or new migrants. They were English as a second language. They didn't understand the Australian industrial system, and they were fighting Westfield. So they were brave, but really afraid, and they are almost always working multiple jobs. So the vast majority of our cleaners are international students. They're limited to working 20 hours a week. They can't survive on that, so they take cash work as well. And then their employer, standard practice is to have your supervisor follow you to your cash job so that they can take photographs of you working your cash job, so that they have evidence to exploit you and extort you by saying that they will go to the Department of Immigration and they will get you deported. That's standard practice. That's just what happens every day. So these guys, when you're having a conversation with them about taking industrial action or losing a day's pay or even seeking to enforce their basic rights, they come from a really vulnerable position. And they also come with particular cultural understandings of union and collective action that mean that union, like I always say that I don't tell taxi drivers that I work for a union because I've been yelled at a lot for working for a union. But if you have a particular cultural understanding of what union is, which is legitimate and based in your own experience, there are that many more barriers to getting involved and that many more barriers to taking industrial action, even if it is notionally protected. But my thing that I wanted to talk about was a little bit different. When Stuart approached me to talk about this, I'm not like a fancy strategist type person, but I think that I'm union in like my soul. Like my parents were unionists, and it is, you know, my equivalent of religion, being an atheist. And so I wanted to come at it from a perspective of why we got to a point where attacking unions and protecting corporations was the norm. And it is the norm. I once went on a date with a guy who, on the first date, he said, I don't believe in unions. Like we're like ferries or something. I mean, ferries like wings, not boats. I know I say it the same. But I used to organise ferry workers, and they didn't love it when I called them the ferry boys because they understood it differently. He didn't believe in them. He was like, that's something for a burgeoning economy, but we have a sophisticated economy and we don't need unions anymore. You know, people are smart enough to be able to bargain for themselves. And that's actually a really polite version of what unionists get day to day about who we are and what we do. There is a degree to which unions are attacked, and I want us, and that corporations are protected in the broad-based narrative of our society that is not an accident. And actually, you need to go back before you look at law to understand how we got here and also what our responsibility is in that. So I wanted to ask you guys a question. What is the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution? Can anyone tell me? The right to bear arms, right? So the Second Amendment verbatim is a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's the full kit and caboodle. The first time that the US Supreme Court held that it was an individual's right to bear arms was 2008. We know it as an individual's right to bear arms. That's what the culture understands the Second Amendment to mean. but it historically hasn't, and verbatim it doesn't mean that. The National Rifle Association started post-Civil War for the purpose of marksmanship training. It was Civil War fighters wanting to learn how to shoot better. They testified in 1934 in favour of gun control. The NRA was not a high-powered political entity. It was an advocacy group for local people who wanted to go out and shoot deer. Its purpose, as described in metal on the side of its building, was firearm safety education, marksmanship training, and shooting for recreation. But in 1977, their leadership changed and decided that the Second Amendment was sacred and it needed to be central to their organisation, but not as it was written. They made a decision that they wanted to be a political force, and they wanted to redefine the Second Amendment as an individual right in the minds of public and lawmakers. So they set about on a 30-year mission to make gun rights a central political issue. In the meantime, the individual right argument was starting to win in another forum. Public opinion in 1959, according to a Gallup poll, 60% of Americans favoured banning handguns. That dropped to 41% by 1975 and 24% in 2012. By early 2008, according to Gallup, 73% of Americans believed the Second Amendment guaranteed the rights of Americans to own guns outside of the militia. Why do I draw that analogy? One, because I'm like wildly obsessed with this article that's like from 2014 that I have a copy of, and I can send you a link that's amazing about the history of it. But B, because there is an analogy to be made in the way that neolibs have positioned corporations and positioned unions. And that is that the NRA had a 30-year vision of what they wanted to do, and it wasn't based in fact. It wasn't based in a literal interpretation of the Second Amendment. They decided that they needed to craft a narrative that supported the end game, and they did it. And they did it through influencing politicians, and they did it through influencing the community, and they did it through influencing media, and in the end, they are incredibly politically powerful. They have legislation and Supreme Court decisions that support them, and everyone knows that the Second Amendment provides the right to bear arms for individuals. And the neolibs have done the same thing to us. For most of the 20th century, the idea that private markets were the best way to organise every aspect of society, the idea that wealth trickles down, the idea that jobs of government was to compete to attract wealth creators by reducing taxes and regulations was considered crazy. It was considered an extreme right-wing idea, seriously entertained by a really small group of people. In 1947, the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Switzerland met. They were 39 people, so maybe slightly more than are in this room. And they included Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, who went on to, influence the way in which the neolibs have rolled out regulation for the last 50 years. They made a decision that they had a long-term vision that wanted to fundamentally change the way in which the community understood their community. They wanted to shift it from being a society to being an economy. They didn't try and tweak the left's concepts. They thought big and they aimed high. They strived to build a society where all forms of social solidarity, including trade unionism, were to be dissolved in favour of individuals and families. It was a radical idea. My generation thinks of it as just fait accompli and normal, but it was radical. In Thatcher's words, economics are the method, but the object is to change the soul. They cloaked their agenda by framing the market society they wanted as natural and spontaneous, and any government activity or the collective as an unnatural influence. And that's where we come in, right? We are an artificial construct. The idea of solidarity or community or workers as a collective coming together is not natural. The idea of an employer engaging with the individual is natural. They created the idea of competitive markets in every aspect of society, including education, water, and pollution and care, as natural. They defined trade union, social security, majoritarian democracy, and taxation and redistribution as unnatural, as interventions on the natural way of being. They started in 1947, but they went and they had a multifaceted approach to how they were going to influence our community. They infiltrated university departments. They invested really heavily in think tanks and international institutions. They started the H.R. Nichols Society, and I didn't know this, in 1986 with the explicit aim of dismantling Australia's arbitration-based IR system, eroding trade union rights, and enhancing capital freedoms, which, you know, is high and lofty as they come. They invested in it. It's estimated that right-wing think tanks in Australia in 1994 had a collective annual budget of 130 million, employed 1,600 people and published 900 reports and held 600 conferences and symposia a year, all funded by corporate contributions and personal wealth. They capitalised on a crisis. Milton Friedman said it best, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions are taken to depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function as neoliberalists, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And that's what they did. Every time crisis struck, such as stagflation or oil crisis or the GFC, they were quick to define the issue on their own terms and impose their own solution. They deliberately stoked instability in the economy to suit their own agenda, creating recessions, deepening deficits, because they knew that these crises would give them political cover for dismantling the institutions that impeded them. And they didn't get hung up on facts, just like the NRA. They shrugged off decades of empirical evidence that still stands, academic work that contested their theories by saying that their ideas just hadn't been fully implemented, so it was too early to judge them. They capitalised on their right flank. And this is a concept that, like, there's a crazy amount of teachers and lecturers in this room, so I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it blew my mind. The Overton window, the idea that the centre of the political discourse is set by its relative ends of the political spectrum. So they, and like you can see this with John Howard, right? Like they take the extreme right and they're like, you are a useful person to me, so I'm going to allow your voice to rise. I'm not going to explicitly criticise it because you fundamentally shift the centre of the political discourse to my end. I had an experience of this. I worked on Obama 2012 in Wisconsin. You'll be pleased to know that all of my areas that I worked flipped Trump this time for the first time since 1988. That was depressing. In a very super working class town called Oshkosh, which is where they used to make Oshkosh Bagosh. It's now made in China. And I was working there, and there was a guy that came out and he said abortion is only acceptable when it is legitimate rape. And he explained that legitimate rape meant that because when it was vaguely consensual, a woman's body was accepting of conception, whereas if it was rape, the woman's body shut down. And so you never needed to have abortion as an option in legitimate rape because it could never happen. And I was like, what is going on? This is crazy. I don't understand why this person is getting national coverage. Like, what is happening? And my boss said to me really simply, she was like, it's really useful for the Republicans to have someone out there saying that that abortion is only acceptable in the case of legitimate rape, because it means that all of their arguments about when abortion is acceptable suddenly become normalized and they become central. And you can see that happening now, right? Like, it's really useful for the libs to have Dutton out there talking about refugees who are not truly refugees. It's really useful to have them have Pauline Hanson or like the other stone cold lunatics that are in there debating the legitimacy of climate change, because it suits them. And what we do in the left, and I say this because I talk about the left in the same way that I think about my mother, in that I can talk shit about my mother to my brothers, but no one else gets to talk shit about my mother. I feel the same way about the left. Like, we can talk shit about the left, but no one else out there can talk shit about the left. What the left does is we smash the socialists or we smash the Greens, because we don't recognise that it's actually super useful And super important to have a whole bunch of people talking about radical ideas, because the right do, and the right celebrate it. And fundamentally, even if you're like a super bourgeois, like right ALP person, you kind of want the middle to move slightly to the left so you can get your agenda up. But we don't recognise that usefulness. We don't recognise the Overton window. We fight amongst ourselves, and the right don't bother doing that because they recognise the usefulness. So that was what the neolibs did, right? Like, they made a plan, they had a broad-based vision, they went, we have to infiltrate this in a whole bunch of different ways, and we need to structurally dismantle this whole idea of the collective in society and replace it with an idea of the economy and the market. And there's some lessons for us to learn from that. They had money and they had access to institutional power, sure. But the Mont Pelerin Society started off with 39 people in a Swedish boardroom, just chitty-chatting away. There is no reason why we can't replicate it to reposition unions and reposition corporations. Because the end game of what they did was to position us as not valid, to position us as third party, to position us as people who are self-interested. And this is what I find fascinating, right, is that my whole gig is about advocating and organising and working with people who are vulnerable workers, but who are powerful workers. If there is no cleaners, if there's no security guards, if there's no childcare workers, if there are no people caring for the elderly in their rest homes or in their homes, shit goes down. People die. Things go bad. But we aren't positioned as powerful workers, my members. And this was the great realization that I had moving from the Fireys to United Voice. There's a whole bunch of complexities that come with being a firefighter. They take enormous risks. They work incredibly hard. They have a whole bunch of health implications by the stress and the nature of their job. But when a firefighter turns up in their truck, people clap. And when a cleaner turns up at night, people walk past them and don't know their names. They don't have political capital, and they don't have social capital, and they often don't speak the language, and they don't have economic power. And so to the first aid guy who was like, you know, I don't believe in unions, therefore a developing economy, I say that there's a big part of our economy that's developing. There's a big part of our economy that's overlooked. There's a big part of our economy that doesn't have political capital and doesn't have industrial power, and fundamentally our union movement needs to figure out how to work with that group of workers who don't have long-term jobs. Because the biggest threat to the union movement now is that we are working to a point where there is no such thing as careers. There's no such thing as lifetime jobs. My guys get jobs through apps, and people bid to pay them the lowest amount that they can. So we have to reimagine what it is in the context where we are not valued and these workers are not valued. And we have to do it whilst fighting that immediate fight. We have to think about the long term. We have to learn from the NRA. We have to learn from the neolibs. We have to have a vision for what we want the future to be, and it needs to be coherent and bold. But it doesn't need to be based in a reaction to what we currently exist in. Imagine if decisions of government and business were not singularly measured by money, but primarily measured by environmental impact and the impact on people. If that was the baseline that we were universally arguing for from the left. We need to work with our left flank and our centre. They both have a role to play in the Overton window. Nothing bores me more than the ALP Greens fight, and it's not just because I come from New Zealand and they've been in minority government together forever and a day. It's because it's not useful. It doesn't help us. And we need to truly organise. And the problem with the union movement is we've been debating organising versus servicing for about the last 20 years, which is incredibly exciting. But we haven't been truly organising. Organising means getting out of the way. If you read the history of the firefighters union, you read a history that started off with firefighters cycling from station to station to organise their comrades with no institutional support and with no money, right? And that was about, they saw the personal imperative in what they were doing. And sometimes the personal imperative for workers is contradicted by the institutional imperative for unions. I say that as someone that works for a union and loves unions. But we need to get out of the way of our members, we need to empower them, and we need to enable them to reclaim the community as they understand it, because they are living the impacts of neoliberalism. They just don't have a framework for understanding it beyond their individual experience. They know they have job insecurity, they know that they can't plan to spend time with their family or go to their kids' soccer. They know that they can't get a mortgage and they can't afford a house. They know that they are disrespected at work and sexually assaulted at work and not paid for sick leave. They live that experience, but they don't have a context for understanding it beyond the individual experience. And we need to enable them to understand it as a demonstration of the system that was created by neolibs and one that we must resist. Not react to, but provide an alternative vision. And we need to be proactive, to genuinely engage members, and to be brave. And at the moment, there's a real tension in our movement between protecting our current institutional power at the risk of losing our future power. We need to be fighting for the potential members we have in the gig economy whilst balancing the interests of the members that we have in the current economy. And we need to be having a conversation with people about what good jobs look like and what that means for you in a holistic sense of engaging in the world. A good job means that your kids go to one school. A good job means that you can afford a house, whether it's renting or most of my members don't buy. It means that you can live in your community and work in your community and go to soccer and go to church and be able to plan ahead and maybe even occasionally take holidays. A good job is not about what you do when you turn up at 9 a.m. or for my school cleaners, 4 a.m. They do a 4 till 8 and then they sleep in their cars and then they do a 3 till 6. This is public sector school cleaners. A good job is about a job that delivers for you and your family and your community. And the union movement has a unique capacity to have that conversation and drive that vision, and we're not doing it at the moment. At the moment, we're reacting. At the moment, we're fighting to survive. And fundamentally, that introspection, that fighting to survive is going to be the thing that kills us. So that's my bit. I hope it was vaguely coherent. Sorry.